Hi, good evening. This is Ramesh. Today is January 31st, 2018. So, tomorrow, our finance minister is going to announce his last full budget for us, for this government, for this Modi government. So, before that budget gets announced, I just wanted to do a little bit of a deconstruction and deciphering of what a budget is really, and then what do they typically do on the components of the budget and stuff like that. So this is my own interpretation. So I thought I'll just put it across. Well, I mean, if you look at what a budget is, it is in a very simplistic terms. Actually, it is trying to do a very fine balancing act between the revenues and the expenditure for a government, for an country, right? Now, in terms of the revenues, like if you look at the left-hand side, you will have the revenues. So, what are the like big ticket items in the revenues? So those will be the taxable revenues and then the non-taxable revenues, right? In the non-taxable, I mean, in the taxable revenues, you have the direct taxes and indirect taxes, and in the non-taxable revenues, you have the investments and the profits or the bottom line from the government-run establishments. Now, in terms of the expenditures, what are they, right? So the big ticket items, again, I'm not going into all the things. So there are totally about six, huge big ticket items. So the first and foremost are the interest payments that we have to do on our debt. And the second will be all the salaries and pensions which are paid out to the government employees. And the third is in terms of the subsidies, there is a fuel subsidy, food subsidy, and fertilizer subsidy. Actually, food subsidy first, and then fertilizer, and then the fuel subsidy in that order, because actually we pay a hefty amount in as a food subsidy, and then the other things come a little lesser. And then the fourth one is in terms of the capital expenditure and the operational expenditure for the government-run establishments, the government-run bodies and organizations. Number five is in terms of infrastructure funding, in terms of like building roads, building dams, and constructions of all those things, and then electrification and rural electrification, and then water supply, and then telecommunications, and in terms sanitations and all those kind of things, right? And so those are the kind of big ticket items that actually you have in the for the expenditure. Now, when I talked about the balancing act, right? So if you do the math, then if the total of your income, the total of your the different sources of revenues is equal to the expenditure, then you are in wonderful shape. But if that doesn't happen, so most a few countries are there actually which are which beautifully maintain that. So they are very kind of self-sufficient, self-reliant, and then so they are in fact actually they are in budget surplus. So they don't have a deficit at all. They have a budget surplus. So where their income is actually much more than their expenditure. Okay, so there are a few countries like that, but then there are also other countries actually which where they are the deficit, the budget deficit countries. So India is one of them. So where actually our incomes do not match our expenditure. Now, when it doesn't match our expenditure, then actually how do we try and match this, right? So there are actually three different methods in which actually you try to do this. So one is clearly in terms of increasing the revenues. So when you want to increase the revenues, then actually you have to increase the taxes, and then you have to increase the profits or the bottom line from the government establishments. So that is one way of increasing. Okay. Now, when you try doing that one, then so that is one way. So let us look at all the various possibilities for a while. Now that is one way. The second way is trying to reduce the expenditure, trying to go the austerity method, austerity approach, and then where you try to reduce the expenditure. And so that is another way of trying to match up this thing. Now, if you cannot do both, or for instance, actually you try to increase the income by increasing the revenues by a certain amount, and then you also tried reducing the expenditure to a certain amount, and still if there is a deficit, okay, this gap has to be financed. So this is called deficit financing. Now this has to be financed from a different other source, right? So typically what then happens is then the country goes in for a borrowing. Now it borrows from internal or external, wherever it is, and then there is a debt. So this is the country's debt which gets added to the this thing, and then it goes on. Now, another way of reducing this borrowing and then trying to get in, this thing is in terms of divestments or disinvestments that the country can actually, government can in fact actually get off from some of the public sector undertakings and some other kind of government institutions. They can actually can dilute their stake, their equities, and then they can get the private parties to come into play, and then they buy their equities and pay money for that, right? So this is one this thing. So now in Indian context, actually, we continue to have this problem. So we have been having this fiscal deficit of about 5.5% of our GDP, and then it was brought down to 5, 4.8, 4.5, 4.24, and now it is actually last year it has been pegged at 3.2%. Now the 3.2% of our GDP is about 154 lakh crores. So that itself works out to somewhere about 4.8, 4.9 lakh crores is the deficit financing, is the borrowings, right? So now, so like last year, see in terms of our the tax revenues, right? So how do we so last year, actually, Modi government did some little work in all these things. So number one is in terms of the divestments and disinvestments. So they had actually planned for about 1 lakh crore worth of money to be raised from the disinvestment and divestment. So which they have done. Now, second is in terms of the how do we increase the tax revenues, right? Now, increasing the tax revenues, there are actually two methods. One is the increasing the tax rates. Now, which if you do, then actually people don't somehow like it because they will have to shell out more money. And secondly, actually, if the tax money they do not see it at work, then actually they get little upset about it. So why should we shell out more money when the government is not doing much for us in any case? So now, they do not. So then the other approach that actually Modi's government took was that in terms of expanding the tax net. So which means that actually they tried to bring in all the tax evaders who were evading the tax, and so they were not actually kind of adding to the coffers. So those were actually brought in. Okay, so which was actually the first was the demonetization. So where actually the individual tax assessees, the taxpayers, they were about 59 million or so in the last year. So now that has gone up to about 69 million. Okay, from 5.9 crores to 6.9 crores. Okay, so that is actually itself it has given us a tremendous about 14.2% increase in the in terms of direct taxes. Now, indirect taxes also in terms of the trader registrations and all those things, there were about 6.5 million kind of trader registrations. That has gone up to about 10 million. It has gone in, right. So now, so that again actually added to a lot of indirect tax revenue, which is actually 22% indirect tax revenues have gone up. This thing. So, in one way, actually, we somehow, I mean, like, the 3.2%, whatever actually we had pegged the fiscal deficit at, I think actually with the actual increase with the increase in the kind of taxable revenues, and also in terms of realizing the kind of divestment and disinvestment of 1 lakh crores, I think we have been able to manage the this thing, and we are probably in a good shape. Okay, so now while we are at it, so in fact actually the interest components itself, see, let us not forget that when we keep on borrowing, right, see, India is actually India's this thing is about 100 lakh crores is the total debt that India has, right? It's about 67% of the of our total GDP. Okay, there are countries actually which are having much more than this. I mean, there are countries with about 100%, 150%, 200%. The PIGS countries, for instance, in Europe, the Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Greece. Now they have about 100% and about 100%, 150, 175, 200, 220% is the debt to the GDP ratio, so which is extraordinarily high, and that is the reason the sovereign rating of those countries are much bad. And in fact, actually, they were also looking at getting out of the euro zone and all those kind of things, right? So anyways, so there are actually, so India is actually at about 67%, which is good. We can call it as good, but then still, if you look at some of the other emerging economies like Brazil, South Africa, and China, so they are at about 45%, 50% is actually debt to GDP ratio. So we should still try and go down. Actually, the idea should be to go down from 3.2 to 3% to 2.5 to 2, and then going downwards, down south, and then at some stage actually we should become budget surplus. So when that is only when actually we will become a self-reliant, self-sufficient country, and we will also be then able to repay our debt. Okay, because until now we have been only repaying, I mean, we have been just paying the interest year on year, and then the debt is continuously going up, right? So that is what actually we have to look at, repayment of this thing. Now, the one other angle that I wanted to talk about was that actually from the disinvestment and divestments. Okay, so when they talk about that, agreed that as an government, I mean, should definitely actually get into only those very very critical sectors. Okay, like the security, the space research, the research and analysis wing, and then also into the armed forces and other these things, whatever, and then it should stay away from other commercial kind of sectors, and that should be left for the private parties to come and play in that. So that is a given. Okay, so that wasn't happening earlier because India had a kind of communist kind of a this thing to begin with, and then slowly it started getting over, getting out of it, and we had the Nehruvian socialist kind of this thing, and then slowly then the liberalization started in 1992, which is when slowly the Indian government started expanding all their opening up all their sectors where the private people can come into play. And so while that is all happening, my worry is that why are these government institutions, government organizations, the government bodies, and all these kinds of things where the government actually had the first mover advantage. It had enjoyed the monopoly for a long, long time, and even monopoly or oligopoly or very less kind of a competition even after the liberalization. And also it has been manned by some of the best of the bureaucrats, with an extraordinary intellectual capacity and all those things. So why aren't they able to run these organizations effectively, and why are they bleeding? For instance, Air India has got about 45,000 crore debt, and the year on year actually it reports loss, and but even after that actually government starts pumping in money just to keep it afloat. Okay, now whose money is that? Those are all the tax money, and those are all the borrowings and all those things. So why actually borrow? See, while leveraged business is definitely a good way of doing, in the sense that actually if you're able to kind of take a loan from somewhere actually for a lesser interest, and if your business can generate something much better than that, then that is a good kind of investment to do. That's a good kind of a this thing to get in. But if your borrowings are not going anywhere, and then if your if it is adding to your interest rates, and then your actually debts keep growing up year on year, then I think that is not a good idea. So I think actually, so it's very strange, this thing that like many times what happens is the government decides to kind of divest or disinvest, and then it gives it to the private party. The private party comes in, and then guess what? In about 2 to 3 years time, then there is a turnaround. Okay, it's able to turn it around, and then they start having better revenues and better bottom line. Okay, now that is very strange, because if the private party, the private people, okay, they are not somebody who kind of come down from the heavens, right? So they are also people like us. So if they are able to run it very efficiently, then why aren't the government the organizations not being run properly? I mean, is it because of a lot of red tapeism? Is it because of non-accountability? Is it because of no responsibility? Is it because of bad efficiency, bad productivity? I mean, all of these things have contributed. So which is actually not a good this thing. So if I guess actually if government can invest some good amount of money in terms of monitoring properly and managing all these government run establishments, I am sure that actually today this particular area actually is contributing somewhere about 2.5 lakh crores to 2.8 lakh crores is the contribution that it is making towards the as a source of revenue. That actually should go up to about 4.5 5 lakh crores. Okay, it definitely has the potential to go up that way. Okay, but for some reason or the other it is not. So I think that should be kind of considered, and if government puts in the right people over there, and then it also kind of ensures that there is not much of red tapeism, and there's not like it just allows people to run it more efficiently. I think then it will probably be the best for everybody, right? So that is another this thing. Now, from Indian in a budget, actually this time this thing, there is one issue which is actually happening is that the crude actually, which we were so fortunate for the last 3 years, actually it had come down from almost about 159 dollars per barrel. The price had come down to almost about 59 $60 per barrel. So now, so that was in 2014, 15, 16. So we had the wonderful period. So that is when we were enjoying all these things, and now that is showing a reversing trend. It is now showing going up north. So when crude goes up north, then it is because we are heavily dependent on crude for everything. So we import about 80% of our crude consumption actually comes from exports, from imports. Sorry. So if the crude price goes up, then immediately actually our import bills start going up, our fuel subsidies start going up, our inflation start going up, and then RBI will step in and then it will say that I'm not going to reduce any interest rates. In fact, I'm going to increase the interest rates because I have to hold the inflation this thing, and then that will lead into some kind of a slowdown in the economy. That will lead into an unemployment. So this is a cyclical process which keeps happening. So crude is something actually which can really be a killer. In fact, actually the statistics say that a $10 increase in the crude can actually bring down the GDP by about 2 to 3%. So but one thing that actually we were able to this thing is that we are actually able to strike a deal with Iran, and then we are picking up a lot of crude from there, the Brent crude. We're picking up a lot of things, and then we are able to pay them in rupees, Indian rupees, and not necessarily in US dollars. So to that extent, actually, we are also able to save on our forex. Our forex reserves have gone up to more than 400, so which can actually help us with almost about 11 to 12 months of our import bills can be catered for in that. And so I guess actually so this year, probably actually tomorrow, when Arun Jaitley is going to announce this thing, um, he's probably going to look at a kind of 5 point agenda, in the this thing. So number one is in terms of kind of job creation. So number two is in terms of reviving the kind of private investments, which has gone down for a long time because of the twin balance sheet issue. And then number three is in terms of like making reviving the agricultural sector and the farming sector. Fourth is in terms of reviving our exports. Okay. Fifth is in terms of making a more healthier. Our banking sector has to become a little more healthier. Those are the five kind of things that actually which we the country. I mean, actually, the government is going to be planning in this budget. And I think actually the I would assume that actually it is not going to be a populist budget this time around, even though given the fact that actually in 2018 is going to be a big time election year, and which would actually mean that the government will actually try and go for a try and go for a populist budget to try and appease all the the people. But I would assume that actually the way that Modi's government has been going all these years, actually it has taken a very very kind of bold reforms in terms of demonetization and GST and all these things. So I'm sure that they will go in for very very kind of growth oriented budget. And the stock market is already kind of it has tested about 11,000 levels in the Nifty, and it is holding strong over there. It's holding strong over there, and then it is so it's probably going to continue there, this thing. So because the foreign direct investors and foreign institutional investors, actually they see a lot of healthy environment in Indian context, so they will continue to keep investing in Indian this thing, right? So that's so I'm expecting a very good budget, a growth oriented budget to be presented by Arun Jaitley tomorrow. So hopefully let's get to see something good, and then stock markets also will start moving. I mean, in spite of the fact that it has actually kind of shaved off around 100 150 I mean 100 points, but that was more for the profit booking and not as a market correction. So let's see how things go. So thank you very much for listening in.